Hello, everyone. Welcome to the British Council of Offices webinar to launch the research briefing note, Thoughts on Office Occupation After Covid-19. My name is Suzanne Gill and I'm a partner in the commercial property team at Wedlake Bell. I'm going to outline the structure of our session today before introducing you to the panel. So we're going to start with a summary of the briefing note from one of its authors. We'll have a panel discussion on some of the main issues arising from the briefing note before opening up the questions to you, the audience, finishing in about an hour from now. If you'd like to ask questions, please submit them through the chat function. And if you're carried away partway through, there'll be a recording of the rest of the webinar on the BCO YouTube channel. The report itself is available from the BCO website in the usual way. So time for me to introduce you to the panel. In no particular order, Chris Early looks after estate management and development for Telefonica or O2, including everything from acquiring and fitting out offices through space management to disposal. He's very active in the debate around new ways of working and is a recognised thought leader. Lee Dimelo is Principal Director for TP Bennett and Head of the Northern Hub. He's been with TP Bennett for over 22 years, originally based in the practice's London office before heading up to open first Leeds and Manchester offices, where he leads a blended team of 30 architects and interior designers. Lee specialises in the development and delivery of commercial office space for both developer-led new build schemes and tenant interior fit-outs. He's an active member of the industry and sits on the BCO's Northern Committee. Peter Runekers trained as an architect and is a development director at Argent. He's currently heading up a team leading the development management of Google's HQ at King's Cross and commercial lead on the regeneration scheme at Brent Cross. Claire Dehani has over 20 years experience in commercial interiors and specialises in workplace consultancy, supporting companies achieve the most from their working environment through detailed evidence-based design. Claire is passionate about research and development in the workplace sector and supports this through membership of the BCO's Regional Northern Committee and the National Technical Affairs Committee. She's led the work on the paper we're discussing today, helped by significant contributions from her co-author, Will Poole-Wilson. Will believes passionately in human experience through space, whether that's wellness, sustainability, to how new technologies drive our work practices, support business objectives, and smart premises design. He's been involved in changing the world of work through design and research and collaboration for over 20 years. An award-winning designer, his research extends to being lead author for the BCO Wellness Guide through pioneering and founding the SKA environmental tool. He's lead design director at Will & Partners and is well respected within both the occupier and landlord community. So, Claire, it's a great report which sets out a lot of the issues my clients are talking to me about. What are the key points to highlight to our audience today?
Thank you, Suzanne. Well, the BCO firmly believe the office will remain. The pandemic has interrupted office life and perhaps changed how we think of the office and how the space might be used. But the office is not dead. It is just different. Our paper, Thoughts on Office Reoccupation After Covid-19, explores some of the learnings from the past 15 months, considering positive and negative impacts on the office through the forced home working experiment that we've experienced in the UK and much of the world. During this time, there has been a lot written and countless surveys undertaken about these impacts, and we've aimed to consolidate the thinking and offer some guidance on the key issues of occupation post-pandemic. We believe the next 6 months to a year will really provide the answers as how individuals and organisations adapt in the long term, if we adapt at all. Once restrictions have eased, fingers crossed, and the vaccination programme is complete, how quickly may we forget and simply return to a pre-pandemic normal? Restrictions and social distancing have also highlighted a huge reduction in the spread of more common coughs and colds. We've all become experts in the transmission of disease, and are we happy to live without heightened cleanliness, mask wearing in public spaces and reduced density in the office? We recognise that if we've learnt anything from the pandemic, the only certainty is uncertainty. And to prove this point, the easing of restrictions was questioned only in the last week due to the concerns over the increase of the Indian variant. However, it is clear that the transition and acceptance of flexible and hybrid working has become an embedded concept in the workplace, a trend that existed but has been considerably sped up by widely accepted due to the pandemic. We have learned that we can continue to work as organisations remotely. It is different and not always as productive, but work has continued in the last year, and people can be trusted to work where they are not physically located with their managers and their teams. This is not a surprise to us workplace professionals, but has been an eye-opener for some organisations who considered flexible, agile, home working, hybrid, call it what you will, as completely unsuitable pre-COVID. Views of the success of home working have changed throughout the course of the past year and very dependent on demographic, age, gender and ethnicity. This time last year, surveys indicated the desire to return to the workplace was low. By October, the BCO's own survey reported almost 2/3 of office-based workers wanting to return in some capacity. Then winter happened. It was dark. It was miserable. A year of restrictions. By March 2021, 85% of the workers were looking forward to getting back into the office. Millennials leading the cries. 89% of them wanting to get back, whereas baby boomers, it was only 80%. So yes, the home working experiment hasn't been as bad as people feared. Working from home can be okay, and some aspects are a huge improvement. But what we do know is that 5 days a week in the home is not an ideal situation for organisations to thrive and grow. As human beings, we need to interact and socialise. We need to belong and feel connected. The office isn't just a building. It is a space where people can be together. The office supports culture, relationships, learning and development, collaboration, and much needed social interaction, as well as more besides. So we assume, much the same as organisations like Google and KPMG have announced, hybrid working will become a normal. 3 days in the office and 2 days at home is a common solution. Balancing and managing the peaks and troughs in occupancy in the office throughout the week will be the next challenge. The fear of a deserted city centre on a Monday and a Friday is a real one. We are already beginning to see the staged transition back into the office. London is creeping back into life, as are other cities. In the short term, reoccupation will consider social distancing and occupancy levels will need to be restricted. But if restrictions lift as planned on the 21st of June, we may well be able to see some level of normality fairly quickly. Time will have to be invested to understand how workers feel about the return. Everyone has had different experiences over the past year, and those experiences should not be ignored by eagerness to reoccupy. HR and people teams will play key roles in managing the transition back and ensuring the mental well-being of their people is supported throughout. When we start to consider the actual space and the office environment of the future, more questions present themselves. What will workers be heading back into the office for? What is the motivation for them to return? If they want to collaborate with colleagues, do we need as many desks? And in fact, is it meeting space and collaboration space that's needed? As mentioned before, how is the occupancy through the week managed to avoid overcrowding midweek and not getting a ghost ship on a Friday? This will be put through policy and procedure on the whole, perhaps booking systems, and perhaps some will choose to close the office 1 day a week. Workplace design has never been a one-size-fits-all solution, and that is probably never truer. Organisations must invest in understanding their business vision and how the workplace can support their people to achieve that vision. There are similarities, but each office and workplace should be unique. We will need to ask questions around physical spaces, hand space, and the more recently added fourth component of ventilation will dictate how we initially reoccupy the office and how we occupy the office of the future. Scientific evidence strongly indicates that Covid-19 is spread more rapidly through airborne particles than touch. As explored in the BCO's publication, Thoughts on Ventilation Design and Operation Post-Covid-19, the occupancy of space is influenced and potentially limited by its ventilation. Understanding and correctly managing the ventilation in existing office buildings will be fundamental to successfully reoccupy. It is critical to balance the commercial pressures put on space, which has led to increased occupancy densities and the health and well-being of its occupants. Awareness of cleanliness has also dramatically increased, and the challenge will lie in the hands of facilities teams and building managers to maintain the office environment to a level where people feel safe to return. Cleaning protocols may adapt to become more visible and frequent. As workplace professionals, we should review the facilities that are available. Should we be offering dedicated hand washing facilities at T points or elsewhere on the actual open plan floor rather than just in WCs? The touchless journey is also a widely debated subject. Many of us in the design industry will have discussed how we introduce less touch points throughout the building and how we can reduce risk through contact with shared surfaces. Multi-tenanted buildings may immediately pose a concern for people returning to the office. Will more flexibility about commute times and arrival and leave times be here to stay to limit overcrowding in these spaces? The past year has made it easier because of technology in our working lives and our personal lives. Technology has supported us to stay connected and continue in our lockdown installation. And connectivity leads to even more questions around the office. Is the large corporate city centre head office still relevant, or can we consider a network of smaller workplaces located to attract top talent? As previously mentioned, the next 6 months to a year will begin to answer these questions, and the answers will not always be the same, but the questions will be and should be. Thank you. You're on mute still, Suzanne.
Thank you twice then. If we've learned one thing over the last year, it's that offices just aren't the same without people in them. Chris, this report is looking forward to hybrid working in the future. How has Telefonica dealt with remote working in the past?
I think the first thing I'd like to say is if we think that as an industry, commercial real estate, that things are gradually going to go back to how they used to be, and we persist with the sandbagging approach or heads in the sand approach, then we're not just missing an opportunity, we're setting ourselves up for a big fall. Yeah, we've been working in a hybrid way for about 10 years now. And our way of working has evolved over that period. So, you know, one of the advantages we had going into the pandemic is, unlike some organizations, and we're not unique, we had a lot of experience of people working at home or working in other locations for large chunks of the week, and they've been doing that for quite a lot of time. So sort of culturally, we were used to it. We had policies to support that. We had the equipment, we had the resources for people to do that. We had the platforms for people to collaborate. We had things like Teams. We transitioned to quite a way before the first pandemic, certainly 6 or 9 months, I forget, prior. Obviously, we'd moved, like a lot of people, from Link and Skype before that. We'd moved over to Facebook's workplace platform, which we use an awful lot for Teams to interact, and also for live streaming of events and all sorts of other things. So A, it was a little bit easier going into that. But B, also, although we certainly don't know what the lessons are fully from this period, because we've got to see what people actually do, and there's a big difference between what people say they're going to do in surveys and what they actually end up doing. And Claire mentioned earlier, asking people in January, first, it depends when you ask people and how you ask them. But what they do could be quite different to what they say. But we have some experience, at least, in seeing over time, when you give people the flexibility and you give them the tools, how they actually behave. And what we'd seen is that on average, people, had ended up coming in 2 or 3 days a week, some less than that. We've got 10% of contractual home workers as well, so they obviously tend to come in a lot less. And yes, Claire also mentioned demand. We get what I call the midweek mountain, and obviously we've been working to address that over time. So we'd had the push from board level down, which is really, really helpful. We're in a business that sells mobile products and services. So of course, we have a vested interest in demonstrating that people can work in different locations. We memorably, back in 2012, actually closed down our HQ for the day in planning for the Olympics. I don't know if anyone remembers that. There was a good video about that. So, true flexible working style. Someone's trying to call me over Teams, so I'll ignore that. So yes, we've been working a hybrid way for a long time. We've learned some of the lessons. We reduced space. So we've actually reduced space net of various other major changes in the structure of the business. We've reduced space by 25% in offices since 2013. And I expect to do more of that over the coming years.
Thanks very much, Chris. It was interesting you talked about contractual home working, because there's a legal angle in all of this, isn't there, which is, can you force your staff to work from home? Have they got a geographical mobility clause in their contract? But today we're looking more at practical issues and those interesting legal ones that work for me. Lee, what sort of things are occupiers doing now if they're looking at hybrid working for the first time, or really ramping it up going forwards?
I think everybody's struggling with the same things at the moment. I think that everybody's worked really well through the last 12 months or so, and I think has adapted incredibly well. But they're all now trying to think, what do we need to do in the short term to adapt to getting back in the office? And I think hopefully, sensibly, people are not making large knee-jerk reactions to make wholesale changes before they actually truly know what that looks like. So I think that there's a number of people, including ourselves, that are looking at how we could actually test that first couple of months back in the office, so we can actually truly understand what everybody in the office is looking for, how we can best service the people that we provide our services to as well. So I think one of the things that we're doing within TP Bennett in the Manchester office, we're actually, foolishly or not, embarking on a 2-month full trial period from the 5th of July, God willing, from the 21st release, where we're embarking on a full agile test for a 2-month period, where we're actually removing all assigned workstations, making everybody entirely docking station based. Everybody will have a laptop. Nobody will have a fixed position that they go into, and we're actually picking up on, I think, a point that Will and I discussed a couple of weeks ago, actually looking at defining the zones within the office space as well, so we can not only test how people come into the space, but the types of spaces they go and use. So we've broken it down into, we've got 20 workstations for 28 people that are unassigned in terms of individuals going to them, and we've broken them down into 8 concentrated workstations, 8 what we refer to as the neutral zones. It sits somewhere in between the quiet and the noisy guys, and then a collaboration zone where we've got a real mix of different furniture solutions, and even down to, technical AV pods where you can have 4 or 6 people sitting doing some collaborative work with an AV interface as well, right down to individual solo booths. And the idea is, over that 2-month period, we're trying to encourage people to come into the office over a different working pattern, just to try and test how this might work going forward. So everything down to the 3 days in the office, 2 days at home, or other mixes as well. And we are asking people to work with their direct teams, the line managers, and understand their clients' needs, so we can try and facilitate that across the week, so we don't end up with this midweek mountain, as Chris suggested there, which I think is happening in a lot of places at the moment. So I think for us, it's really trying to look at how we can flex that 2-month period to understand how people do gravitate towards certain spaces. And we've even, I think that the guys will love me for saying this, we've even set ourselves up to, as a halfway point, having a review of where we've got to, and if needs be, actually remove some of the desks as well and put some alternative settings in to see if we could even push further the 20 seats to 28 people. We'll drop it down to potentially 16 seats to 28 people, and try that for a period of time in that 2-month period as well. Because we're incredibly conscious of the fact nobody's got the solutions or the answers to all of these at the moment. And I think the more that we can do as an industry to try and test all of these different ways, which is about how often people are in the office, what they do when they're in the office, encouraging people to come in for primarily, I think, collaboration reasons, I think is something that's going to be quite strong going forward to make the office a magnet for people to come to. So I think it's something that hopefully people will take a lot of benefit from after that 2-month period. We will issue a note out to the industry, just try and share some of our experiences and understanding of how those different spaces have been used. So I think a lot of people are going to be doing the same. I think those first 2 months back are going to be quite I think, intense in terms of really trying to push and pull what the office space should be doing for people. But I think the important thing is nobody's got predetermined answers at the moment, because we're in an ever-changing world. On a day-by-day basis, the circumstances change and we have to react to them. So I think it's important to keep an open mind and really go in on that basis.
I think your pilot sounds great, Lee, to be honest, just to interject. It's a great way to go about it. There are lots of people trying to sell wholesale changes to office. It's a very dangerous road to go down. The other thing is ripping out all the desks, as Neil Usher said recently. I hope people aren't throwing away all those desks. Yeah. You can break down and look at what people are actually doing as part of their day-to-day roles. People are performing tasks that are inherently desk-based, whether or not you like it or whether or not you call it a desk.
Yep.
So yeah, being able to sort of adapt and analyze, that sounds fascinating. It'd be great to see the results of that.
Yeah.
Well, that segues neatly into the next stage of the debate. I'm going to keep you a lot of time, you know that, don't you? And I think we need to distinguish, don't we, between short-term adaptations, if you like, and long-term answers. So looking first at retrofitting, and as you said, throwing things out, Chris. Peter, when you look at retrofitting existing buildings, ventilation's got to be key, hasn't it, surely, if we've learned that?
I think it has, and actually the BCO paper, not to plug the BCO papers too much, but their thoughts on ventilation in a post-COVID world, and particularly the reference, if anybody has the time to read the REVA report, which it refers to, and the shift that the WHO made back in July of last year about COVID being essentially an airborne transmitted disease, really changes the way that we need to think about our workplaces in the future, and how we're going to retrofit either existing workplaces, because we know that a lot of contemporary offices really don't have the ability to give you access directly to fresh air. And as we highlighted in the drivers change a couple of years ago, which were spookily prescient, the focus on wellness and well-being of the individual in the workplace, and what they do, to both Chris's and Lee's points, the focus on what their actual working is going to be and how they go about it in a healthy manner, is the focus on that is just going to increase dramatically. And so I think there will be organizations will hopefully be looking at their existing building stock. They will be looking at what they need to do to it to improve natural ventilation and access to natural ventilation. And it's not just that, it's that whole wider focus on the indoor environmental quality that we have seemed to have lost a little bit of a focus on in recent times. So I think there will be a lot of looking at how you can retrofit opening lights or access to ventilation, how you can shift your existing mechanical ventilation systems over to higher levels of fresh air without having to go to massive levels of filtration. In fact, that's one of the things that has been clear from both the BCO's report and REVA's and others, that it's not about massive amounts of filtration, it's access to all of the things that we know and love, that we, when we're out of the office in that natural environment, access to nature, access to sunlight, daylight, all of those things. So I think actually, as Lee and Chris have highlighted, when you start to look at how you're going to reorganize your workplace and all of the functions that go on into it, one of the significant components has to be thought about what that indoor environmental quality is going to be. And it is going to make it trickier for a lot of the existing stock where it's harder to retrofit. That's where good relationship between the landlord and the tenant is going to be critical. We've seen that in our own building stock, where we've worked with tenants during this awful pandemic to work out how they can best reconfigure their workspace access in particular. I think access multiple routes to allow you ins and outs, and all of that kind of thing is going to shift, is refocus on the kinds of welfare facilities that we have. The other note on washroom facilities is very good. Will there be a focus more on super loos as opposed to the trad loos, which are, for lots of reasons, let alone diversity, but in terms of health and well-being now, kind of really perhaps they've had their time. So I think there are lots of issues in terms of both the stock going forward, but also what you do to your existing commercial workplace. It's not just about the actual physical workplace itself.
Thanks very much, Peter. Will, one of the things I really liked about the report, which of course you co-authored, was the emphasis on the fact that not all workplaces are the same. Talk to me, this is dear to a lawyer's heart, talk to me about cellularisation and the implications of that.
Well, I think the first thing is I sort of demyth the cellularisation. Cellularisation won't be any solution, and actually I think it will broadly stay the same. I think what I would go back to is point people back in the direction of looking at the BCO Wellness Guide, which goes to a lot of what Peter's talking about, and it layers up the concept of health and well-being, ventilation, density being key, and what Lee's talking about. So it actually pre-COVID was pointing to a direction of testing out with pilot studies, then going through a process, not a full run-in, this is how we have to solve it. And actually there's almost a framework already in that it covers cellularisation as a particular topic, and was looking at a view to perhaps what we're seeing more of is cellularisation will be about collaboration spaces, meeting rooms, but what are their real uses in the space? Cellularisation actually otherwise is a different topic, it's about zones. That may for some people be about departments as occupiers, And certainly the pilot studies that the whole team, the technical committee, are looking at through the process over the next 6 months all point to zoning being a very good way to looking at how to think about topics like cellularisation or agile working, or how you're going to have assigned desking. So I think that's a great way to tackle the answer. And I think it sort of wraps in quite neatly how everyone's thinking at the moment. So I think the next 6 months terribly exciting, because it's testing a lot of past thinking and how we might go about things.
Thanks very much.
About density, I thought was a very good one, actually, because
it is something that we need to look at both in the short term, but more critically, I think, in the long term. And in some ways, it's easier to think about the long term because you start with, we know what changes will be needed to adapt. People can adapt quite quickly to hybrid working, but buildings can't.
Well, a significant point on that for occupiers to think about is, and we knew this pre-COVID, was that absenteeism was increasing, and it had a correlation only, and correlation obviously isn't proof, to the absenteeism. With all the data in the last year, it does now seem that actually there is a direct relationship to sickness and absenteeism. And I think it's going to be very hard for occupiers to ignore that. So I think density will change. I think it's incredibly difficult, particularly when for the people returning and their human experience, what they're really bothered about is health. And they're extremely conscious. People have learned to live with being less close to each other and thinking about density. There's a transport question as well. So I think all of those will play into what we experience and understanding that human experience of what everybody wants in the office.
Claire, this really plays into, sorry, go on.
Sorry, just while I'm, if I may, very quickly, I think just picking up on one of the points that Peter made, and I think he's touching on what Will's done as well. It'd be interesting to see whether there would be a marginal relaxation on the gross to net demand from a developer's architectural perspective, bearing in mind, the demand for superloos, the coordination of circulation within those core areas. For us to hit that magic 85% marker, which most developers push us towards, makes those cores incredibly tight. So it'd be interesting to see whether the evolution of those offices may change in the future to actually make them a little bit more user focused around how you interact with people within those core areas, which might relax that gross net factor slightly. I appreciate there are financial implications on those changing and making them stack up from a feasibility perspective, but interesting to see if that would potentially change the core circulation strategy in the future.
Well, that does segue me very neatly, actually, Lee, into my question to Claire, because how the core affects the economics depends on what occupiers will pay for ultimately, doesn't it? And so, Claire, when you're developing interiors and working with your clients, what do you do to find out what occupiers really, really want, no matter what month of the year it is?
Well, I think the interesting thing about what we do as workplace consultants and the whole team on here is every business is completely unique. Every time we're dealing with a client, their demands and their requirements are different. That's led by what they're actually doing on a day-to-day basis, what their output is, what makes them productive and how they function. And the challenge we sometimes do come up against is that we'll be talking to the C-suite and they'll have very clear ideas about what they want to do and what their vision of the business is. And yes, let's make everybody home workers, let's change the way that we're working. But that doesn't necessarily always capture what people are actually doing on a day-to-day basis. And actually understanding the granular detail of how people are, what they need to do their job properly. Are they, as I think we've already mentioned, that people can be desk-based. There is a lot of desk-based activity that goes on still and will continue to do so. Not everybody is in a meeting. Not everybody needs to collaborate to do their roles. There are roles that are very, very focused, very quiet work. How that happens, and that's not necessarily a solution that individual, because they're not collaborating, can do that at home. They might not have an environment that they can work effectively in at home. So I think really it's about understanding that not every business and not every business's requirements are the same, but also not everybody's individual requirements are the same. And unless we really look at it from a very human-centric position, we won't get the best workplaces and the best environments for people to succeed and achieve. And
I think you're right, Claire, but in terms of disputes about, I haven't seen many disputes in public about people being forced not to go back to offices. I mean, the disputes at the moment are about old school CEOs trying to force people back to offices. You know, a good instance in the US recently of a newspaper where that was attempted and everyone went on strike for the day. But I don't know if too many people are being forced to stay at home. I'm sure there are instances of that.
Yeah, and I just think it's about choice, isn't it? And ensuring
Exactly.
that, but also not every business has a situation where choice can happen. If you've got regulatory requirements where you have to be going into the office and that home working doesn't work for that particular business as key reasons, it's just about that choice level and understanding what's appropriate for each business on a unique level.
Peter, that brings a real dilemma for developers, doesn't it? Because you've to design for as many people as you possibly can to market your product. They're all different. Do we need to rethink our understanding of grade A space? And also, once you've delivered your grade A, how do you future-proof that for the occupiers? My clients really hate licenses to alterations for very minor changes to their internal layout.
And way leaves. Let's get way leaves, Suzanne.
Yeah, and we hate going through the paperwork as well. Look, I totally agree. I think it is going to fundamentally change what people consider grade A office spaces going forward, and it may well counter to Lee's point. You know, if we are relaxing, and we may well need to relax a bit on the efficiency levels, but better quality space should also be more in demand, which should therefore lead to slightly better rent. So there should be a balance out of those two things. But I think as any developer has seen and any tenant has seen over the recent years, there has been, I think it's been a real balancing act between what you deliver as part of the base build and what you deliver as part of the fit out. And very rarely do you see a full Cat A fit out, which is then reused and occupied by a tenant, because it's very wasteful. It never really suits what the tenant actually needs, and you need to spend too much time remodeling it. And I think actually getting that balance right and resetting what the landlord delivers to the tenant, and actually basically having the conversations having more and more conversations, having more adaptability within the central core facilities. I think it's only going to be that kind of collaboration, and those conversations are going to just come to the fore more and more as we go forward. And I think it will change. We will need to change some significant parts of our industry to change their thoughts on what would be needed. We might need to get out of those kind of mindsets, you know, in the C-suites in particular, because really it's going to be focusing on what is more productive for the workplace, what is the occupier going to really be, and it won't be that smaller group at the very higher levels within the company. It will be the wider organization as a whole and how it works. So I think actually I think it's going to be interesting to see what we cover and what the response will be when we start to look at fit out guide going forward from the BCO, and how much of an overlap there is more and more. Every time we redo the BCO guide to specification, and I'm sure Neil Pennell, if he's listening to this, we talk about the balance between the base build and the fit out. And I think it needs to shift dramatically. And it could go one way. It could be that the base build is really, really simple. It is even more of a base build. And then you work with the tenant to fit out to exactly what they need. But again, that comes at a cost. And it then questions you start to look at the whole appraisal cycle. Or it could go that you go towards the more fuller model of where you actually integrate the full fit out. You go beyond our standard Cat A. Very rare that we actually do. I can't think of the last time that we actually did just a standard full Cat A fit out in a building. I don't know if the rest of the panel has had that same experience recently. We certainly haven't, not at King's Cross. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you. Yes. And it brings me on to the next one. So far, we've been looking at individual buildings, but Will, I'd like to turn to you about a wider question about the role of the office itself. And and what it means. Will we still see those trophy HQ offices that people will rush to, do you think?
Well, I think you've got to remember that buildings give messages, but the message might have changed slightly. So I think you still need an HQ. You still need a place that says who you are. And I think, you know, buildings are the best piece of branding you can ever have. That's probably not going to go away. I think our predictions of what an HQ and how much it might reduce by, I think Chris said earlier that they were looking at a reduction of about 25%. I think broadly speaking, that's probably true, that HQs might shrink at a level of about 20%. I think that probably is a figure you could start to think about, but it's what does that look like? Because that doesn't mean that all the space miraculously went away. If you like, it's a bubble of space all over the place. And if you push it, squeeze it down here, it just pops out somewhere else. So that has gone to perhaps a third space, a third working space. And this is the hub and spoke model that a lot of people are talking about. And I think what we're beginning to see is that transformation. But I think we've also got to remember that people haven't had, a lot of people haven't had a very good experience working from home. In fact, we're really beginning to understand that it has a huge health and well-being impact. It's got legal questions, which are very difficult. So the question about where is the spoke is actually fascinating, and what does the spoke do? And it leads to the question of what is the digital HQ? Clearly that still needs a physical space. It has something. So where are these spaces? Because certainly young people want to learn, so they do want to come to the HQ. The HQ is probably more of a collaborative educational facility, but then it's different for different people. Certainly we've experienced a lot of lawyers, which plays a, clearly they do want cellularisation, by the way, but equally they also do want an HQ, because actually it's important that the people they work with are around them. So a lot of that is about the role of the creativity of a lawyer in terms of what they're writing. Same for the perhaps what are then called the creative industries. Do include lawyers in that actually, and that's important. So I think thinking those things through still remains to be seen, and those strategies are only just forming now. So in there is an enormous question about transport, and I think the government will actually have to think, and it's not, this isn't a place, BCO probably won't be involved with that, but there's going to have to be serious thought about what is the experience of people's journeys, perhaps the curb to desk experience, or even just the door to desk experience. What is that for the future? So we're seeing a lot, and we're hoping that our report by October will include a lot of that thinking from some of the pilot studies that we're beginning to see. But I do think, broadly speaking, it is a 3-day week. Where's the hump curve during the week? That's a big question. What's the mountain to climb? We don't know. That's probably the sort of simple answer I'd give to that, Susan.
Thank you. And one of the things you touched on there obviously was the journey, and not everyone's got a space they can work at home, or the broadband. Chris, do you think we'll see increased use of third-party space like the co-working spaces near people's homes? And interestingly, do you think employers will want to pick up the cost of that?
Just quickly to correct William on something, I have got rid of 25% of space, and I didn't acquire lots of other space to offload it. And I am looking to get rid of more space. And if I haven't got rid of it in a year's time, I'd be very surprised if there's not some net reduction. So I just don't think you'll end up with the same amount of net space. But anyway, that's something to plan out.
Chris,
I do think sorry.
Do you think that space has been absorbed into people's homes? Where's that space been absorbed into?
I think it's a combination of things, William. So obviously there's an element of activity-based working within that. So it's whereas people, where you have more tightly controlled or isolated neighborhoods before we move to activity-based working, it's rejigging the physical environment to align with that and creating different zones, all of the usual things. And it's quite a bit of home working, because we find even people who haven't got a great working environment at home, there's always going to be the odd day when they wake up and think, actually, what have I got to do today? I just need to get my head down and do some stuff, whatever it might be. And it's one day and they work from home. And that's your starting point. And you work down the scale from there. The argument has become a bit stale this year, because people have been talking about a pandemic situation where everyone is forced to stay at home. versus when everyone was in the office. So we just didn't really quite see that tension. I think it's a very different discussion when, yes, you've got maybe a limited space at home, but it's not so often. So I think that's really where it sort of worked out. There's a combination of all those things and people being offered other sites, maybe some of our other sites or some of our customers, some of our suppliers' sites as well. So it's a mixture of different things, really. And obviously we're just one company, but I don't think that's unusual if you give people the tools and the flex and you flex the space. But yeah, to the point about third-party spaces, I think this is a really exciting area, and the report doesn't really go into this, but there are a lot of offerings at the moment. There's a lot of demand in the flex sector. Obviously, the flex sector was squeezed quite badly during the downturn because it was the first thing people could offload, but it is picking up quite quickly. There are not just more and more providers and lots of interesting niche providers who are providing some great experiences, but there's also a lot of other platforms evolving. There are aggregators, there are companies like Upflex where you can go and buy passes on a subscription model, but actually those passes cover a huge range of different sites from different suppliers and different locations, so you can just pick and choose. There are other tools like Cody and Liquid Space in the US, which give you a lot of other options too. There are solutions like a small outfit called SpaceMize, which is an interesting example, I think, because they're looking at monetizing unused hotel space, especially, possibly restaurant space as well. But you know, can you go in and drop in somewhere and work in a lobby without looking over your shoulder all the time because you've actually booked a slot and booked a suitable location? So this all opens up all sorts of opportunities. Some corporates have already jumped into this. So Standard Chartered, notably NTT, have signed deals, haven't they, with IWG, which is what most people know as Regis. And it'll be interesting to see what other companies go down that route. And maybe in some cases, individuals will be paying for it themselves. And the other interesting thing about this, I think, is the fascinating opportunity to build on what's happened in the pandemic and really sort of reinvigorate local centres, you know, and also the retail on the back of that, because if you have a more dynamic, if you have less dormitory towns and people are actually engaged more in the local community and present more during the working week, that could completely change the dynamic.
It's interesting, isn't it? And there, again, legal issues here. Some of the third party provider spaces go big on glass walls, and that's not great for anyone working on anything confidential, whether they're a lawyer or whether they're, you know, working up their pitch for Dragon's Den. So as we've said before, not one size fits all, but it seems clear that offices do have a future, whether or not people are keen to go back. Lee, maybe we need to entice them back in. Some of the ideas I've heard about sound more like a restaurant than an office, to be honest. But what can architects and designers do to help encourage people back to work and make the most of their time at the office?
I think the first thing we need to do as an industry is recognise that we are an incredibly diverse bunch. I think the far ends of each spectrum that actually cover all of the people that we, you know, class as friends, colleagues, and everything else in between. We need to recognise that people will have hesitancy about coming back into the office over what's happened the last 12 months and trying to think about how their overall well-being is actually taken into account when they're coming back in. And I think, you know, picking up everything from introvert to extrovert and where those spaces might sit within an office environment. The one thing that somebody said recently, which I think is absolutely key, is there was always really good design and really good strategies behind design before the pandemic struck. None of this is groundbreaking new things that's being designed as a result of the pandemic. All it's done is pushed all of that to the forefront and massively changed the timescale in which we were looking at things, which is amazing. It's one of the very few good things that have come out of the last 12 months. And I think it's making sure we keep our foot to the floor on that one and actually keep driving forward while everybody's got the appetite to look at changing the ways in which you get people into the office to make them more collaborative tools and actually make people want to go there to do specific things. I think it's something we really need to collectively make sure that we keep driving forward. And I think following those simple theories that we've all talked about, the zoning of spaces to make sure that the different types of people have got the spaces that are specific and relevant to them and enable them to do what they need to do for the times that they are in that office environment, I think is incredibly important. And I think it's just listening to people, giving them a voice and actually having the ability to actually not feel ashamed to say, I'm slightly nervous about coming back into an office environment. We've been in our own bubble for the last 12 months, which for some people would have been absolutely amazing. For others, it would have been the worst thing in the world. That they like being around people. They like that tactile nature of actually being in the middle of a space and want to get back in that vibrancy of an office environment. Others will be terrified at the prospect of doing it. So I think it's just making sure we're considerate of people's needs as they come back in, not just in terms of what kind of a desk do they need, but what from a mental well-being perspective, what does that look like as well? So I think it's really important that we keep that at the forefront.
Claire, quite a lot of this is emotional rather than logical. And Philip Graham Clare's picked this up in the chat as well. How can designers help with that Hearts and Minds campaign to lure people back to the office?
I think, as we already touched on, I think a lot about that communication piece, understanding what people actually feel, what their experiences have been. And as Lee very rightly said, everybody's had a different experience. There will be people that have loved the last 12 months and their confidence has grown. I've heard stories of people saying that one of their team members who's incredibly shy suddenly can do presentations because they can do presentations over Zoom and they're not in a room full of 100 people. There has been negatives and positives. Technology has massively enabled us to work and continue to work in this way, which we wouldn't have been able to do probably even 10 years ago. We've been in a very good position, but that doesn't pick up on how people have felt about it. If people have lost loved ones, if they've been very ill themselves, they could have very, very real anxieties about returning back into the world. And unless the employees and designers listen to those fears and see what we can do to make the experience more comfortable, we will all be failing those people. And there's elements like, touchless journey has been discussed an awful lot. Should we be making it contactless when you walk into these spaces? As we've already mentioned, ventilation actually is one of the biggest spreaders of contagion rather than it being touch. But we have all become much more sensitive to what we're touching. Do we want to hot desk? Do we want to share a desk with other people? And that's, there's contradictions to, we're going into the office to collaborate, we're going into the office to be with people, but for some people that's going to be a very real fear. So what do we do if we're sharing technology? How do we maintain that and keep it clean? And the touchless journey is an excellent way in order to be able to do that, where you don't actually need to, you can flow into a building through face recognition and it's completely free. However, there's also data protection issues around that and nervousness around whether or not that's actually what people want to do. And I think I'm quoting Chris here that Google have recently explored that and that employees aren't interested. I mean, obviously we all know that Google follow us wherever we go anyway, but even as an organization, their employees don't want to be followed in that way when they're actually in the workplace. They don't want somebody to know that they've nipped off to go and take a personal phone call in the lobby or whatever else. And I think there's an element of balancing that choice around, we're saying, yes, you can be free, you can be flexible, we need to put our trust in you as an individual to do what you're contracted to do, versus Big Brother watching you. And I think it's a challenging balance.
Thank you very much. Right, I'm going to open it up to questions now and start with one raised in the chat, which I think is for you, Will. Alan West has referred us to the ARUP Work Unbound policy, where staff are actually allowed to use their weekend as a flexible benefit in meeting their contracted hours. And I wondered how you felt that played into the wellness concerns that you've been so eloquent about.
I think fundamentally that probably plays into a really important question, is the value of HR within thinking about workplace, so human resources. And actually, I think it plays to a new role that's evolving, which is the people officer, and the need for a well-being officer or a welfare officer that thinks in that way, perhaps separating out from HR. I'm a huge advocate of working in that manner, but when you do it, it's very important to sit down with your teams, have a leadership structure that understands that way of working. And you need to make sure that that leadership structure is very aware of what people are doing. So, what does it mean to space, I think is still a bit of a question, but it's certainly it certainly plays to what is happening at the moment, how people are using third workspaces, because what do you do at a weekend? Do you go to a third workspace? Do you work at home? Have you got a shed? What's the answer? Nobody quite knows, as Chris was pointing out earlier. So that is important. So I think you've got to think about that. I think it's a great thing to do, but I think the leadership needs to understand. I think that's very much the team leaders ultimately need to have a responsibility, and I think organising those structures are incredibly important. Therefore, I think people are making a point in terms of HQ. What does it mean in space? Perhaps it does mean that spaces need to think about more being like a home, but it's different. It's still an office. Making it more connected to the person and what their needs are, very important. But also, how do we bring that back to home? What are the experiences? I think these are really tricky questions, which still need to be worked out, and we're still working with at the moment.
And also, it just reminds me of a really important point that asynchronous working, as you could call that, is that's not going anywhere. I don't think. That's been obviously emphasised and developed more during the last year, and I don't think that's going to go away. And I think the other thing in terms of buildings will be patterns of use, and obviously for the transport network, patterns of transport, not just by the day, but within the day. And in fact, we've even seen this pre-pandemic with some of the patterns I talked about, that over time, people were coming in and disappearing at different times. So it wasn't, there were peaks within the day, not just within the week. And I think we can see more of that. And there are obvious downsides if you're just adding on hours at the weekend to a full week. And it's not always easy to get a balance. But there are also big advantages in terms of being able to schedule your life in a different way and being able to include different people who've got other obligations in their private family lives.
It does raise one other quite interesting question, which is the environmental question. I think this still needs to be worked out as well. There is a view that less people traveling to work will reduce environmental impact. But equally, people are looking at what is the environmental impact of people working in different spaces and then moving around to them. And even in the home, for example, a really weird one, but it's quite funny, is the amount of loo roll went up. That wasn't because necessarily people panic bought. It was actually because people do their ablutions more in the workplace. So there was a real reason as to why that happened. But that beggars a huge question about the environmental impact. At one level, that will settle down, I'm sure. But actually, there are clear environmental impacts of people staying at home, because you've then got less efficient use of a building because people are heating it permanently, using energy in a very different way. And the responsibilities of how people are using those systems is really important. So I think there are very, very large questions to be asked around the hub and spoke models, how people move around. And
that's never going to offset the environmental impact and the embodied carbon of building a whopping great building that you only need 50% of, is it? To be honest, I mean, we get real. If we include the journeys, the operational environmental impact of running the office and the embodied carbon, and then all the changes within the life cycle, and then the decommissioning of that building. I mean, offices, the wrong sort of offices in the wrong location are going to have a terrible environmental impact, aren't they?
That's a question for another day, Chris. I'm glad you raised it, but we're not going to cover it today at all. Let's move on to the question from Diorano, which is either for Peter or Lee, or possibly both. And they would like to know, does the traditional space planning model of hard occupant numbers against soft ancillary space needs to be turned on its head? Do we need more shared ancillary space for collaboration, writing, communal use, all as part of the Cat A? I don't know which one of you wants to go first on that. It's a great question.
It is a good question. I'll do a very short answer. I think yes, it's already there. We've seen it in the fit outs of the more advanced organisations and through the kind of TP Bennett and others that do this kind of work for occupiers. I think the challenge for us is I can't think of how many years we've talked about long life, loose fit, and the true, there's a real distinction between adaptability and flexibility. but the true flexibility in the workplace. Because whilst you might have that, there will be a need for a greater amount of ancillary spaces, the location of those ancillary spaces will need to move. They will need to flex and adjust as the workplace patterns adjust and flex of the occupiers and their needs going forward. So how does the base build cope with that? And back to your earlier point about licenses, how do we make adjustments a lot more easy and a lot less onerous? So I think the full answer is yes, but there is a lot of work on both sides to being able to make that happen. Over to Lee, you can probably do it in a lot more detail.
You've got 2 or 3 minutes, Lee.
I could probably cover this in one. So just very quickly, one thing that we've seen come forward in the last couple of years in an abundance is what a lot of people are now referring to as a Cat A plus scenario that landlords are offering outside of the tenant areas, where you're offering enhanced spaces that are still common areas within the building that it allows people to relax the amount of space that they need within the building that's demised as theirs, but gives an area of collaboration that actually encourages interaction with others as well. So in some instances outside of your organisation, which is a fantastic thing to do in a building. So I do think there is a merging of different ways you could approach what landlords are offering and what tenants therefore need to take up. It might have a slight change in the way that the service charges and things like that are actually born, but there are definitely ways around it.
Thank you.
I just quickly add that the tenant, I think tenants have got a responsibility as well here, haven't they? You know, because how often have tenants gone down the old, what I call hero fit out route, and the landlord puts something in and the tenant ripped it all apart, and then it's ripped apart at the end. It's an environmental disaster.
It is.
And it would make so much sense in some cases if the landlord was trusted and able to deliver more of this, both at the front end and also during the term. And we could just avoid some of this wastage and just, you know, that there's a big opportunity here, I think.
Totally agree.
And I also think just on the issue about the traditional brief for the space planning, you know, yeah, I totally do not think an occupier telling us we've got 250 people that we need to plan into this building is actually a relevant brief anymore, because without, as we've mentioned before, without understanding what they're actually doing, how many people are going to be in the office, what are they coming in for, what are they going to be doing, that we don't want to be planning 250 desks just because that's their head count. And I think that's absolutely critical. That can't be the way forward.
That's a long-term change, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Sadly, we're out of time. I think we could have gone on much longer on some of the issues here. Thank you very much to Claire, Will, and your colleagues for such a thought-provoking brief, available on the BCO website. Thank you to our other panelists, Peter, Lee, and Chris. And of course, thank you to you all for making your time to join us today and for your questions. The BCO Technical Affairs Committees exist to promote, develop, and promulgate best practice in offices. And I think if even half of what we've heard about today makes it into an office near you, you will indeed want to go back to it, and we'll end up with something much better than before. Do download the briefing note if you haven't done so already, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.